The roar of the ocean was deafening, a relentless cacophony that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The air was sharp with salt and cold, stinging my skin and burning my lungs as I stepped closer to the edge of the cliffs. Hollow Point Lighthouse loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and broken against the gray sky. The structure seemed to lean toward the sea, as if the ocean's pull was too strong to resist. It was a place that felt alive, thrumming with a presence that pressed against my chest with every step. The path leading to the lighthouse was overgrown, the weeds and brambles clutching at my ankles like desperate hands. My flashlight's beam cut through the twilight, bouncing off jagged rocks and casting fleeting shadows that danced unnaturally along the ground. My stomach twisted with every step, the knot of dread tightening as the lighthouse grew larger, its massive iron door visible through the thinning mist. It wasn't just the lighthouse that unnerved me. It was the absence of sound beyond the waves. No birds called, no crickets chirped, no breeze rustled the tall grass. The world felt muted, as though the ocean had swallowed everything else, leaving only its relentless voice. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else, something faint but persistent, like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt them. They brushed against my mind, cold and invasive, pulling me closer. I stopped a few feet from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. The iron surface was streaked with rust, the hinges warped and brittle from decades of exposure to the salt air. But what caught my attention wasn't the decay. It was the scratches. Deep, deliberate gougers ran across the door in chaotic patterns, their jagged edges catching the faint light of my flashlight. My fingers brushed against one of the marks, the metal cool and sharp beneath my touch. It felt fresh. I turned to look at the others, but their faces were unreadable in the dim light. Chris' jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the door, while Beth clutched her jacket tightly around her, her breath visible in the cold air. None of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, weighted by fear and something else. Something unspoken, something we couldn't name. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of rot, sharp and cloying. My stomach churned and I turned away, my flashlight's beam catching on the jagged rocks scattered across the cliffside. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my hands as I reached for the door. The metal groaned under the weight of my push, the sound cutting through the air like a jagged knife. It swung open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The air inside was different. It was colder, heavier, pressing against my skin like an unwelcome touch. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I stepped inside, the beam slicing through the thick gloom to reveal a narrow hallway lined with decaying wood panels. The walls were damp, streaked with black mold that twisted and spread like veins. The floor creaked under my weight, the sound muffled, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was sharp and metallic, undercut by the sickly sweet stench of decay. It filled my lungs with every breath, clinging to the back of my throat like oil. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to keep moving, the flashlight's beam flickering as it illuminated the strange, disjointed shapes ahead. The second thing I noticed was the camera. It was lying on the ground just a few feet inside the door, its casing scratched and dented, but otherwise intact. My chest tightened as I crouched down, my fingers brushing against the cold plastic. It was Ben's. I knew it without needing to check. My flashlight caught on the faint smudges of dirt and something darker on its surface, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. The camera was still recording. I didn't realize my hands were shaking until I struggled to press the playback button. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment, all I could hear was static, broken by the faint, rhythmic hum of the ocean. The footage showed Ben's face, pale and drawn, as he spoke directly into the camera. His voice was low, urgent, but the words were garbled, swallowed by the interference. Behind him, the walls of the lighthouse loomed, twisted and unfamiliar. The screen flickered again, and the footage shifted. The camera was moving now, panning across the narrow, decaying hallway, the beam of Ben's flashlight catching glimpses of symbols carved into the walls. They were jagged, angular, their shapes twisting and shifting as though alive. He paused on one symbol, the frame trembling. As he moved closer, the whispers began then, faint and unintelligible, growing louder as the screen went black. The video ended abruptly, leaving only silence and the faint, rhythmic tapping of something distant, just barely audible over the sound of the waves. My breath caught in my throat, and I dropped the camera, the screen flickering before going dark. The sound of the tapping didn't stop. Echo. God, it was dark. It grew louder, sharper, and I realized with a sinking dread that it wasn't coming from the camera. It was coming from deeper inside the lighthouse. Engwoods, Baditer, ein Sis, Grauwurs. The others had moved closer, their flashlights casting long, shifting shadows along the walls. We shouldn't be here, Beth whispered, her voice trembling. But none of us moved. The tapping was steady now, deliberate, each beat resonating through the floor. The walls, my chest. I felt it pressing into me, unraveling the edges of my thoughts. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the hallway, wrapping around me like smoke. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the beam, a shadow, long and angular, twisting unnaturally against the wall. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, the floor groaning beneath me. And then, from somewhere deeper inside the lighthouse, a voice called my name. The voice calling my name sent a shiver racing down my spine. It wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. The way it slithered through the air, low and deliberate, carried a weight that made my chest tighten. It came from deeper within the lighthouse, where the shadows were thickest, shifting in ways that defied explanation. The tapping hadn't stopped. It had grown louder, more deliberate, resonating with each step I took toward the source of the sound. The others followed close behind, their flashlights casting long, trembling beams of light across the warped, mold-covered walls. The carvings etched into the panels seemed to twist and writhe as the beams passed over them, their jagged shapes barely visible beneath layers of grime. My stomach churned as I glanced at them, and I quickly averted my gaze, unwilling to let their unnatural forms settle in my mind. We came to a narrow staircase, spiraling upward, the wood groaning under the weight of time and neglect. The air grew colder as we ascended, each step creaking beneath our feet. The tapping seemed to echo from everywhere now, each beat reverberating through the staircase, vibrating in my bones. The voice was gone, but its absence wasn't a relief. It left behind a silence that felt alive, watching, waiting. At the top of the stairs, we found ourselves in a small, circular room. The walls were lined with broken furniture, splintered chairs, a shattered table, and what looked like the remains of an old lantern, its glass cracked and its metal rusted. The floor was littered with shards of wood and glass, the air heavy with the stench of mildew and something metallic. My flashlight beam caught on something in the corner, and I froze. It was a bundle of clothing, stained dark and crumpled, as though it had been left there to decay. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw the faint outline of a jacket. Ben's jacket. My breath caught in my throat, and I crouched down, my hands trembling as I reached for it. The fabric was damp and cold, and as I lifted it, something fell from the folds, clattering to the floor with a hollow sound. It was a rusted key, its surface tarnished and rough, tied to a piece of fraying twine. My fingers brushed against it, and the moment I picked it up, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing against my ears like a living thing. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment the room seemed to shift, its edges blurring, the shadows stretching longer than they should have. I stood slowly, clutching the key tightly in my hand, and turned to the others. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide as they scanned the room. Did you hear that? Chris' voice was barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. He was staring at the far wall, his flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated a large, jagged carving etched into the wood. It wasn't like the others. This one was deliberate, intricate, its lines forming a twisting, spiraling pattern that seemed to draw the eye toward its center. Beth moved closer, her flashlight steady, and I saw her mouth move as though she was speaking, but no sound came out. Her expression twisted into something I couldn't describe. Fear, maybe, or something deeper, darker. She reached out as though to touch the carving, but Chris grabbed her arm, pulling her back sharply. "Don't," he said, his voice firm but shaking. "Enundu." The sound seemed to snap her out of whatever trance she'd been in, and she stumbled back, her flashlight beam jerking wildly across the room. The tapping resumed. It was louder now, sharper, coming from beneath us. The floor trembled faintly with each beat. the vibrations spreading through my legs and into my chest. I stepped back instinctively, the key in my hand growing colder, its rough edges biting into my skin. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, thickening like ink, and the carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their jagged lines glowing with a sickly rhythmic light. The key. Wah. The realization hit me like a blow, the weight of it settling in my stomach. The key wasn't just a random object. It was tied to whatever was happening here, a part of something bigger, something I couldn't yet understand. The tapping grew faster, more frantic, and I turned toward the staircase, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. "Downstairs," I said, my voice trembling but steady enough to carry over the noise. The others hesitated, their eyes darting between me and the dark, twisting carvings on the walls. But they didn't argue. We moved quickly, the stairs groaning beneath our weight, the air growing colder with every step. The tapping led us to another door, smaller and more decrepit than the first. Its surface was warped and splintered, the wood stained dark with age, and something else, something that smelled faintly of iron. I held the key tightly, the metal icy against my palm, and inserted it into the rusted lock. It resisted at first, but with a sharp twist, it turned, the door creaking open to reveal a narrow spiraling staircase leading down into the darkness. The air that wafted up from below was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of decay. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the void, the shadows seeming to swallow the light whole. The tapping was louder here, echoing up from the depths, each beat resonating through the stone walls like a heartbeat. We descended slowly, each step cautious, the sound of our breathing harsh and uneven in the suffocating silence. The staircase seemed endless, twisting downward in impossible spirals, the walls growing wetter, the air heavier. The tapping grew louder with each step, and I felt it pressing against my chest, my thoughts unraveling the edges of my mind. And then we reached the bottom. The room we entered was vast and circular, its walls lined with more of the jagged carvings, their lines glowing faintly with a pale, sickly light. The floor was slick and uneven, and at its center stood a massive stone seal, its surface covered in symbols that pulsed faintly in time with the tapping. The air here was colder than anywhere else, sharp and biting, and the weight of the room pressed down on me, suffocating. The seal trembled faintly, the symbols glowing brighter as the tapping reached a deafening crescendo. And then the seal cracked. The crack in the seal spread with an agonizing slowness, the sound sharp and deliberate, like glass fracturing under pressure. The air around me vibrated with the force of it, a deep guttural hum that seemed to rise from the stone itself. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam casting jagged shadows across the circular walls, and I fought the growing urge to drop it and run. The room seemed to shrink and expand at the same time, the carved symbols on the walls pulsing with light that was too alive, too aware. The seal wasn't just breaking, it was unraveling. A low, rhythmic noise filled the chamber. Not quite tapping anymore, but something heavier, deeper, and alive. The vibrations climbed through my legs and into my chest, shaking my ribs and making my teeth ache. I stumbled back, my hand brushing against the slick, damp wall, and felt an overwhelming wave of nausea wash over me. The air was thicker now, heavy and suffocating, as though the room itself was alive, breathing with something ancient and unspeakable. Chris swore under his breath, his voice trembling, as he aimed his flashlight at the cracking seal. "What's happening?" he asked, but no one answered. His words were swallowed by the hum, the noise pressing against us from all sides, relentless and inescapable. Beth stepped closer to the seal, her flashlight illuminating the jagged lines of the crack as it spread. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice shaking, barely audible over the noise. "We're making it worse." I wanted to agree, to say that we needed to turn back, to run, but my feet refused to move. Something about the seal held me in place, its impossible glow pulling at the edges of my mind, unraveling my thoughts. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to writhe under the beam of my flashlight, twisting and shifting in ways that defied explanation. The crack widened, the hum deepened, growing louder and more insistent, and the room trembled violently, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. The air was colder now, sharp and biting, and with every breath, I felt the weight of the place pressing harder against me, pulling me down. The seal pulsed faintly, its glow growing brighter, and I saw something move beneath its surface. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, shifting just beneath the stone. "Do you see that?" Beth's voice was barely a whisper, her flashlight beam fixed on the seal. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she stepped back, nearly tripping over a loose stone. Chris grabbed her arm to steady her, his own face pale and drawn, but his eyes were fixed on the same thing. The shadow moved again, more deliberate this time, its jagged edges pressing against the cracks in the seal. The glow around it flickered and twisted, and the hum shifted, the rhythm breaking into an erratic, frantic beat. I could feel it now, not just in the air, but in my chest, my head, pressing against the edges of my thoughts. The seal was holding something back, something that wanted out, and it was succeeding. Downwheel and depth. The crack split open further, the jagged line spreading like a wound, and the glow from the seal flared brightly, forcing me to shield my eyes. A sound broke through the hum, then sharp and guttural, like a roar muffled by water. The shadow beneath the seal surged upward, slamming against the stone, and the entire room trembled violently, the floor splitting beneath our feet. The light flickered out. For a moment, everything was dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and air and thought. My flashlight flickered weakly in my hand, the beam catching glimpses of the walls, the shifting carvings, the faint pulsing glow of the seal as it continued to fracture. And then, in the silence, the whispers returned. They were louder now, clear and deliberate, speaking words that didn't make sense, but filled me with a bone-deep dread. They wrapped around my mind, cold and invasive. pulling at memories, fears, things I thought I had buried long ago. I stumbled back, clutching at my head as the whispers grew louder, sharper, overlapping until they became a single overwhelming voice. The seal shattered. The noise that followed was deafening, a sharp, piercing crack that reverberated through the chamber, shaking the walls and sending debris crashing to the floor. The light from the seal flared once more, impossibly bright, and then extinguished entirely, leaving only the faint glow of the carvings on the walls. The shadow that had been trapped beneath it was no longer there. It was in the room with us. The air grew colder, the hum returning with a deeper, more resonant vibration that rattled in my chest. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam catching glimpses of something jagged and angular moving through the darkness. It wasn't solid, not entirely. Its form shifted and twisted like smoke, its edges sharp and fragmented, and it moved with a deliberate, predatory grace that made my stomach turn. Chris screamed. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight catching on his pale face as he stumbled back, his eyes wide and fixed on something I couldn't see. He was shaking his head, his flashlight clattering to the ground as he tripped over a loose stone and fell to his knees. "No," he muttered, his voice breaking. "No, it's not real. It's not real." The shadow surged toward him. "Empathy, hold, theirs." The beam of my flashlight trembled as I swung it toward him, catching the faintest glimpse of the thing as it moved. Its form twisted and writhed, fragments of its jagged edges breaking apart and reforming as it advanced. The air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and I felt my chest tighten, the weight of its presence pressing against me like a physical force. "Chris!" Beth shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. But the thing stopped just short of him, its fragmented form coiling and shifting. The whispers grew louder, sharper, pressing into my skull, and I felt my legs weaken, my knees buckling beneath me. The shadow moved again, slower this time, its jagged edges stretching toward the far wall. The carvings there flared brightly, their light searing into the darkness, and the thing recoiled, its form twisting violently before it disappeared into the shadows. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. The room was still now, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and something metallic, and the weight of what had just happened pressed against me with unbearable force. The seal was gone, shattered into fragments that glowed faintly in the weak beams of our flashlights, and the thing was loose. Down. The air felt different now, thicker, colder, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't escape. The seal was gone, shattered into jagged pieces scattered across the slick stone floor. The faint glow that lingered in the broken fragments flickered weakly, pulsing in an uneven rhythm like a dying heartbeat. My legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground as I stared at the remnants, my mind struggling to process what we had unleashed. The whispers were gone, but the silence they left behind was worse. It was dense, suffocating, and alive. It wrapped around me, pressing into my ears, my head, my thoughts. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the weak beam cutting through the oppressive gloom. But no amount of light could dispel the suffocating darkness that seemed to emanate from every corner of the room. Chris was still on his knees, his breaths ragged and uneven, his hands clutching at his head. Beth crouched beside him, her flashlight casting erratic shadows across the walls. Her face pale and drawn. Her lips moved, as though she was speaking, but no sound came out. Her voice swallowed by the silence. I stepped toward them, my legs unsteady beneath me, and reached out, my hand brushing against Chris's shoulder. "Chris," I said, my voice low and trembling, barely more than a whisper. The sound felt intrusive in the stillness, and I winced as it echoed faintly through the chamber. He flinched at my touch, his head snapping up, his wide, bloodshot eyes locking onto mine. There was something in his gaze that made my stomach twist. Something raw, fractured, as though the weight of what we'd seen had splintered something deep inside him. "It's not gone," he muttered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. His hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the broken seal, his knuckles white. "It's here. It's in the room." I didn't want to believe him, but I felt it too. The air was charged, crackling with an energy that pressed against my skin, my chest, my thoughts. The jagged carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their glow dim but persistent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching us. My flashlight beam flickered as it swept across the room, catching glimpses of shifting shadows that twisted and coiled at the edges of the light. Beth stood abruptly, her flashlight trembling in her hand, her face pale and streaked with sweat. "We need to leave," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the oppressive silence. Her gaze darted toward the shattered seal, the fragments scattered across the floor, and I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. "No." The shadows moved. It wasn't the flicker of our lights, or the tricks of our exhausted minds. It was deliberate. The darkness twisted and stretched, its edges sharp and jagged, coiling like smoke before pulling back into the corners of the room. My breath caught in my throat, my stomach twisting as the faint hum returned, low and guttural, vibrating through the stone and into my bones. "It's awake," Chris said, his voice trembling. He stumbled to his feet, his flashlight swinging wildly, the beam catching on the jagged remnants of the seal before darting to the twisting shadows. "It's awake, and it's here." I didn't need to ask what it was. I could feel it, the presence pressing against my thoughts, cold and invasive, unraveling the edges of my mind. My knees weakened beneath the weight of it, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The beam spun across the room, illuminating the jagged carvings, the fractured stone, and the shifting shadows. And then it spoke. The sound wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It wasn't something I heard with my ears. It was deeper than that, a vibration that resonated through my skull, filling my thoughts with images and emotions I couldn't comprehend. It was cold, sharp, and overwhelming, pressing into every corner of my mind, forcing out everything else. The room blurred around me, the air growing colder, heavier, as though the very fabric of reality was straining under the weight of its presence. Chris grabbed my arm, his grip tight, pulling me back toward the staircase. "We have to go," he shouted, his voice cracking, but his words felt distant, muffled, lost in the overwhelming noise that wasn't a noise. My legs moved on instinct, following his lead, my steps uneven as the ground trembled beneath us. The shadows surged forward, coiling and stretching, their jagged edges glinting faintly in the weak beams of our flashlights. The carvings on the walls flared brightly, their light searing into the darkness, and the thing recoiled, its fragmented form twisting violently before vanishing into the gloom. The hum deepened, growing louder, more resonant, vibrating through the stone and into my chest. We reached the staircase, the narrow steps spiraling upward into the faint glow of the lighthouse above. Into we was down above. The air was colder here, sharper, each breath burning in my lungs as we climbed, our flashlights casting long, jittery shadows on the damp wall. The hum followed us, echoing up the staircase, relentless and inescapable. When we reached the top, the silence returned. The narrow hallway stretched ahead, its walls slick with moisture, the carvings glowing faintly in the weak beams of our flashlights. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of salt and decay, and I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest, each breath a struggle. The shadows at the edges of the hallway shifted and twisted, their movements sharp and unnatural, and I knew without looking back that it was still following us. We moved quickly, our footsteps echoing faintly through the hallway, the light from our flashlights casting fleeting shapes on the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in the oppressive silence, and I forced myself to keep moving, to keep breathing, even as the air grew colder, the weight heavier, the hum louder. The lighthouse wasn't letting us go. The lighthouse wasn't letting us go. MV Connect Sarah Penica. The air pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were alive and closing in. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the floor, the walls, and into my bones. My flashlight beam quivered, casting erratic light across the hallway, but it felt like a futile effort. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was alive, pulsating, watching us. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead of us, the same slick walls and jagged carvings, repeating like a distorted loop. My pulse thundered in my ears as I glanced behind me. The shadows writhed at the edge of the light, their sharp, angular forms twisting and shifting in ways that defied logic. Every step we took felt heavier, slower, like the air itself was fighting against us. Beth stumbled ahead of me, her flashlight clattering to the ground. She let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she grabbed at the wall for support. "I can't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's too much. You can't stop," I said, my own voice thin and trembling. I reached for her arm, pulling her upright, but the weight in the air was crushing us both. We have to keep moving. Chris was just ahead, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he turned a corner. "This way," he called, his voice raw and desperate, but the words didn't feel reassuring. The path ahead was twisting, narrowing, the walls seeming to pulse faintly, as if they were breathing. We turned the corner and found ourselves in a larger room, circular and empty, save for a single object at its center. My flashlight caught the gleam of metal, a rusted, ancient-looking chest, its surface covered in more of the jagged carvings. The hum was deafening here, so loud it felt like my skull was splitting. The carvings on the chest pulsed with a faint, sickly glow, and the shadows coiled tightly around its edges. I stepped closer, my legs trembling beneath me, and crouched down to inspect the chest. The carvings weren't just decorations, they were a language, intricate and deliberate, their lines twisting in ways that made my head ache if I looked at them too long. There was a faint vibration coming from the chest, a low, resonant pulse that matched the rhythm of the hum. "It's locked," Chris said, his voice hollow as he stepped closer. He reached for the chest, his fingers trembling, but Beth grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp and panicked. "You don't know what it'll do." "We don't have a choice," Chris shot back, his eyes wide, desperate. His flashlight beam caught the jagged lines of the carvings on the walls, their glow growing brighter, more erratic. "It's either this, or we keep running until it gets us." I didn't want to agree, but he was right. The thing wasn't going to stop. Every view, they'd stop. The shadows were closing in, their movements sharp and deliberate, pressing against the edges of the room. The air was colder now, sharper, and I felt the weight of the chest's presence pressing against my chest, my mind, my soul. Chris reached for the chest again, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The moment he touched it, the hum shifted, deepening into a low guttural roar that vibrated through the room. The carvings on the chest flared brightly, their light blinding, and the air crackled with energy, sharp and electric. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes, but the roar didn't stop. It grew louder, sharper, each vibration tearing through me like a blade. The chest opened. The light that spilled out wasn't natural. It was dark, sharp, twisting, a void that seemed to consume the air itself. Shadows surged from within, coiling and writhing, their jagged edges glinting faintly in the unnatural glow. The roar became a scream, piercing and endless, and I felt my knees buckle beneath me, the weight of the sound pressing me to the ground. From the shadows, it emerged. Oh, the thing was larger now, its fragmented, jagged form stretching to fill the room. Its limbs were sharp and angular, its edges shifting and flickering like a distorted image. The void where its face should have been pulsed faintly, a sickly, rhythmic glow that matched the beat of the hum. The air around it was sharp and cold, searing into my skin, my chest, my thoughts. Beth screamed, stumbling back as the thing stretched toward her, its jagged limbs coiling and shifting. Chris grabbed her arm, pulling her away, but the thing didn't stop. Its fragmented form twisted violently, the void at its center glowing brighter, and I felt it pressing into my mind, unraveling my thoughts, my memories. No, I shouted, my voice cracking as I stepped forward, my flashlight beam cutting through the shifting shadows. The light seemed to push the thing back, its fragmented form recoiling slightly. But it didn't disappear. It shifted toward the chest, its jagged edges coiling around it, and the hum deepened, the air growing colder, heavier. Chris grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, but the words felt distant, muffled, lost in the overwhelming roar of the room. The shadows were closing in, the light from the carvings flickering weakly, and I knew we didn't have much time. The thing turned toward us, its jagged limbs stretching, and I felt the weight of its gaze pressing against me, cold and unrelenting. The hum grew louder, more erratic, and the shadows surged forward, swallowing the light, the room, everything. There was no escape. The shadows surged forward, swallowing everything in their path. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the encroaching darkness. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones, into my thoughts. The thing loomed above us, its jagged, shifting form stretching impossibly tall. The void where its face should have been pulsing with that sick, rhythmic light. It wasn't just looking at us. It was peeling us apart, unraveling every thread of who we were. Chris grabbed my arm, his grip iron tight, his breaths shallow and ragged. "We have to," he started, but his words were swallowed by the roar that filled the room. The sound wasn't just noise. It was weight pressing against my chest, my head, my mind, until every thought felt like it was splintering into pieces. The chest, at the center of the room, trembled violently, the carvings on its surface glowing brighter with every pulse of the void. The thing coiled around it, its fragmented limbs stretching toward the edges of the room, and I felt the floor shift beneath my feet, cracks spreading outward like spider webs. Beth screamed, stumbling back against the wall, her flashlight clattering to the ground. Her wide eyes locked onto the thing, and I saw the moment the weight of it broke her. She slid down the wall, her hands clutching at her head, her body trembling as though the air itself was crushing her. I stumbled toward her, my legs heavy, every step a battle against the suffocating weight that pressed against me. "Beth," I shouted, my voice cracking, but she didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the thing, her lips moving in a silent whisper, her breaths shallow and uneven. Chris was at my side, his flashlight casting wild, erratic beams across the room. "We have to stop it," he said, his voice shaking but firm. His eyes darted to the chest, to the glow that pulsed from within, and I knew he was right. The thing wasn't just feeding on us. It was using the chest, drawing power from it, growing stronger with every passing second. The carvings on the walls flared brightly, their light searing into the darkness, and for a moment the thing recoiled, its fragmented form twisting violently. The hum deepened, sharper now, vibrating through the floor and into my chest. My hands trembled as I gripped my flashlight tighter, the beam flickering as I swung it toward the chest. The light caught on the jagged carvings, the faint shimmer of something moving beneath the surface, and I felt a jolt of understanding. "It's tied to the chest," I said, my voice trembling as I turned to Chris. "We have to destroy it." Chris hesitated, his eyes darting to the thing, to the shifting shadows that coiled around the chest. "And how do we do that?" he asked, his voice rising, the panic breaking through his resolve. "We can't even get close to it." The thing surged forward, its jagged limbs stretching toward us. And I grabbed Chris, pulling him back as the air crackled with energy, sharp and electric. The glow from the chest flared again, brighter this time, and I felt the cold bite of its presence pressing against my skin, my chest, my thoughts. And then I saw it, the dagger. It was lying on the ground, half buried beneath the shattered fragments of the seal, its blade glinting faintly in the weak light. My heart pounded as I stumbled toward it, every step a battle against the suffocating weight of the room. The thing twisted violently, its fragmented form coiling around the chest, the roar growing louder as the dagger came into view. Chris grabbed my arm, his grip desperate. "What are you doing?" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar. "It's the only way," I said, my voice breaking. My hands shook as I reached for the dagger, the cold metal biting into my skin. The carvings on the blade pulsed faintly, their lines glowing with the same sickly rhythm as the chest, as the thing. It was connected. I didn't know how I knew. I just did. The thing surged toward me, its jagged limbs stretching, the void at its center glowing brighter. The shadows twisted and coiled, the air crackling with energy. But I didn't stop. I raised the dagger, the blade heavy in my trembling hand, and drove it into the chest. The moment the blade struck the metal, the room erupted in light. The carvings on the walls flared brilliantly, their jagged lines burning into my vision, and the roar reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through every cell in my body. The chest trembled violently, the glow from its surface flickering and twisting, and the thing let out a sound, a deep, guttural howl that rattled the walls, shaking the very foundation of the lighthouse. The shadows recoiled, twisting violently as the chest cracked beneath the weight of the blade. The hum deepened, sharper now, cutting through the air like a blade, and the thing's fragmented form began to splinter, its jagged edges breaking apart, dissolving into the darkness. The floor beneath us gave way, sending me crashing to my knees. The dagger was still embedded in the chest, its carvings pulsing faintly, and I could feel the energy draining from the room, pulling the thing back into the void. The air was sharp and electric, the light blinding, and I felt my vision blur, my thoughts unraveling, as the weight of the moment pressed against me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The room was silent. The hum was gone, the air still and heavy with the scent of ash and something metallic The chest lay shattered at the center of the room, its jagged fragments scattered across the stone floor. The glow from its carvings extinguished. Carvings on the walls were dark now, their jagged lines lifeless, and the thing was nowhere to be seen. I collapsed to the ground, my chest heaving, every muscle in my body trembling. Chris was beside me, his hands clutching at the ground, his breaths ragged and uneven. Beth lay motionless against the wall, her eyes closed, her face pale. It was over, or so I thought. And the silence was unbearable. It stretched across the room, thick and oppressive, as if the world itself had forgotten how to breathe. My chest heaved as I gasped for air. The cold stone beneath me, the only anchor to reality, the shattered chest, lay at the center of the room, its jagged fragments glowing faintly with an eerie, fading light. But the thing, the fragmented, shifting nightmare, was gone. Or so I thought. Chris groaned beside me, his face pale and streaked with sweat, his trembling hands clutching at the floor. "Is it over?" he rasped, his voice raw and cracked. His wide, bloodshot eyes darted toward the chest, to the lifeless carvings on the walls, as though he was searching for reassurance that the nightmare had truly ended. I wanted to tell him it was over, that we had won, but the words wouldn't come. Ennui, carne. My body screamed for rest, but my mind wouldn't stop racing, every nerve still screaming that we were not safe. I looked around the room, my flashlight's weak beam casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked wall. The carvings no longer glowed, their jagged lines dormant. But the air was still wrong, too heavy, too cold, and too still. Beth was slumped against the wall, her head tilted forward, her hair hanging in damp strands across her face. I crawled toward her, my knees scraping against the rough stone. My hand trembled as I reached for her shoulder, shaking her gently. "Beth," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Beth, wake up." Her head snapped up suddenly, her wide, unblinking eyes locking onto mine. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the emptiness there, the faint, sickly glow that flickered deep within her irises. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, she began to laugh, a low, hollow sound that sent a cold shiver racing down my spine. "Beth?" Chris' voice was sharp now, the fear in it cutting through the oppressive silence. He stumbled to his feet, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he stepped toward her. "What's wrong with her?" "You mean? We tried to die soon." She didn't respond. The laughter grew louder, sharper, echoing through the room in unnatural, discordant waves. Her body convulsed violently, her hands clawing at the air, and I scrambled back, my stomach twisting with dread. The faint glow in her eyes grew brighter, pulsing in time with the remnants of the hum that lingered faintly in the air. And then she stopped. Her body went rigid, her laughter cutting off abruptly. leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing. The glow in her eyes faded, replaced by a look of confusion, of fear. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at me, then at Chris, her hands shaking as she clutched at her chest. "What's happening to me?" Before I could answer, the floor beneath us trembled. The faint glow from the shattered chest flared suddenly, its jagged fragments vibrating against the stone. The hum returned, low and guttural, vibrating through the air and into my bones. The carvings on the walls flickered faintly, their jagged lines pulsing with a weak, erratic light. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the truth. It wasn't over. It had never been over. The air grew colder, sharper, and the shadows around the edges of the room began to shift, coiling and twisting in unnatural patterns. The fragments of the chest seemed to move, their edges glinting faintly as they began to pull together, their jagged pieces sliding across the floor like shards of ice drawn to an unseen force. "No," I whispered, the word escaping before I could stop it. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand, its beam catching on the shifting shadows, the faint flickering glow that seemed to pulse in time with the hum. Chris grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate. "We destroyed it," he said, his voice breaking. "We destroyed the chest. We stopped it." "No," Beth said, her voice hollow, distant. She was staring at the fragments, her eyes wide and unblinking, the faint glow flickering faintly in her irises once more. "It wasn't the chest. It was never the chest. It's here. It's in us." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, the weight of them sinking deep into my chest. "Where's?" The hum grew louder, sharper, the air vibrating with its intensity, and the shadows surged forward, their jagged edges glinting faintly in the weak light. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, and I realized with growing dread that she was right. The thing wasn't gone. It had never been contained in the chest. It had only been waiting, growing stronger, feeding on us. The room trembled violently, cracks spreading through the walls, the floor shifting beneath our feet. The light from the carvings flared brightly, searing into the darkness, and the hum became a roar, deafening and relentless. The shadows surged forward, coiling and twisting, their movements sharp and erratic, and I felt the weight of the thing pressing against me, unraveling the edges of my mind. Chris screamed, his flashlight falling to the ground, its beam spinning wildly across the room. Beth collapsed to her knees, her hands clutching at her head, her voice rising in a strangled cry that was swallowed by the roar. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, sharp and metallic, and I felt my chest tighten, my vision blurring as the weight of the thing bore down on us. I tried to move, to scream, but the air was gone, the world narrowing into a single suffocating point of cold and darkness. The last thing I saw was the faint, flickering glow of the carvings, their jagged lines twisting and writhing before everything went black. The silence in Red Hollow was unnatural, heavy and suffocating, as though the town itself were holding its breath. I stood in the middle of the cracked main street, the dirt crunching faintly beneath my boots, and felt the weight of something I couldn't explain, pressing against my chest. The buildings around me, weathered storefronts, an abandoned saloon, and a decrepit church with a sagging steeple, stood like hollow sentinels, their windows dark and lifeless. The sky above was gray and low, the air sharp with the scent of iron and earth, and the wind carried with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I clutched the letter in my hand, its edges frayed from where I'd folded and unfolded a dozen times during the drive here. The words were burned into my mind, the elegant scrawl promising answers to the nightmares that had plagued me for months. It was signed by someone I didn't know, someone who had lured me to this forsaken place like a moth to a flame. The same name was on the letters I'd seen in the hands of the 3 strangers who had arrived just before me, their expressions just as wary and confused as my own. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. Not a single sound broke the heavy quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects. The absence of noise was deafening, as if the town existed in a pocket of nothingness, untouched by the world outside. I glanced over my shoulder, my gaze lingering on the gravel road we had driven in on. It stretched into the horizon, vanishing into the haze. But there was no way out now. The keys to my car had disappeared the moment I had stepped out. We'd searched for hours, but none of us had found anything. The others lingered nearby, their unease palpable. A woman named Callie, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, scanned the buildings with wary eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Beside her was Marcus, a wiry man with sharp features, who kept glancing at his phone, even though it had lost service the second we arrived. The third was Henry, an older man whose nervous energy was betrayed by the constant tapping of his fingers against his thigh. None of us knew each other, but the letter had linked us in a way that felt deeply personal and deeply wrong. The wind shifted, carrying with it a low, mournful sound that made my stomach twist. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it came from somewhere deeper within the town. My skin prickled as the whisper grew louder, weaving through the air like a thread, and I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding against my ribs. The others froze, their heads snapping toward the same direction, their expressions mirroring my own unease. At the end of the street, half hidden by the haze, stood a weathered sign, Red Hollow Mining Office. The building was larger than the others, its windows shattered and its roof caved in on one side. The whisper seemed to emanate from there, threading through the cracks in the walls, beckoning us closer. I didn't want to move, but my feet carried me forward, drawn by an invisible force that gnawed at my thoughts, filling them with fragmented images I didn't understand. The ground beneath my boots felt wrong, uneven and soft, as though the earth were shifting beneath my weight. The others followed, their footsteps hesitant, and the closer we got to the mining office, the colder the air became. The whisper was louder now, curling around my mind like smoke, indistinct but insistent. I felt it pressing against my skull. A low vibration had made my teeth ache and my breath catch in my throat. The door to the mining office hung askew on its hinges. The wood splintered and blackened with age. The faint light filtering through the haze barely reached inside, casting the interior in deep shadows. I hesitated at the threshold, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I cast its beam across the room. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shards of glass, and scraps of paper yellowed with time. The walls were lined with rusted filing cabinets, their drawers hanging open, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. As I stepped inside, the whisper stopped. The silence was instant and absolute, pressing against my ears with a force that made me wince. My breath hitched, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight, the beam darting across the room. There was something wrong with the space, something I couldn't quite name. The light caught on the far wall, illuminating a faded map pinned to the peeling wallpaper. It was a map of the mine, its labyrinthine tunnels sprawling like veins beneath the town. The moment I stepped closer, the whispers returned. They weren't faint anymore. They were sharp and clear, filling the room with their overlapping tones. They called my name, each syllable dragging across my mind like a blade. My knees buckled, and I clutched at the edge of a rusted desk to steady myself, my flashlight beam shaking as it caught on something in the corner of the room. It was a door, half hidden behind a collapsed shelf. The wood was marked with deep scratches, as though something had clawed at it in desperation. My heart thundered as I moved toward it, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. My hand trembled as I reached for the rusted handle, the cold metal biting into my palm. Behind me, the others murmured, their voices barely audible, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The whispers drowned out everything else. I turned the handle, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was small and dark, the air colder than ice. My flashlight beam caught on the far wall, and I froze. Scrawled across the peeling wallpaper in jagged, uneven letters was a single word. Echo. The letters were smeared, dripping as though they had been written in blood, and I felt my stomach twist. Beneath the word was an object, a small rusted box, its surface covered in scratches and faint carvings that seemed to shift when I looked at them. The whispers swelled, their tones sharp and discordant, and I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows in the room seemed to move, coiling and twisting at the edges of the light. I turned to the others, my voice shaking as I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Behind me, the box emitted a faint, rhythmic hum, and I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. And then the screaming began. The screaming tore through the silence, raw and primal, echoing through the building and piercing straight into my skull. My knees buckled, and I clutched at the edge of the rusted desk, the flashlight in my hand shaking violently. It wasn't coming from one of us. It was deeper, resonating from the very walls, from the earth beneath us. It wasn't just sound. It was a vibration, cutting through the air and rattling in my bones. The box on the floor emitted a faint hum, its carvings pulsing with a dim, irregular glow. The whispers that had been clawing at the edges of my mind now screamed in unison, overlapping in a chaotic chorus of voices. They weren't calling my name anymore. They were chanting something, words I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my chest, twisting and pressing against my thoughts. Behind me, Kelly gasped, her hand clutching her throat as she stumbled backward. "What is this?" she managed to choke out, her voice trembling. Her flashlight beam darted wildly across the room, catching on the peeling wallpaper and the dark stains that seemed to stretch farther every time I looked. Marcus grabbed her arm, his face pale and drenched in sweat, but his eyes were fixed on the box. "It's coming from that thing," he said, his voice barely audible over the screaming. His hand reached for the flashlight at his belt, his knuckles white as he clutched it tightly. "We need to get out of here." But I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the box, on the way its carvings seemed to shift and writhe, their jagged lines forming patterns that made my head ache if I stared too long. The hum was louder now, a low, pulsing vibration that matched the pounding of my heart. The room felt colder, the air sharper, biting against my skin like needles. I stepped forward, barely registering the panicked voices of the others. My hand reached out as though drawn by an invisible thread, trembling as it hovered over the surface of the box. The moment my fingers brushed against it, the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy and absolute, pressing against my ears like cotton, muffling even the sound of my own breathing. The whispers were gone, but the weight of them lingered, their presence etched into the corners of my mind. My hand recoiled, and I stumbled back, my flashlight beam flickering weakly as it swept across the room. The box began to shake. The carvings on its surface pulsed brighter, their shifting lines glowing with a faint, sickly light. The hum deepened, vibrating through the floor and into my chest, and the ground beneath us trembled. I turned to the others, my breath catching in my throat as I saw their wide, terrified eyes. Henry backed away, his hands raised as though to ward off something unseen. "Don't touch it," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't." The box cracked open. A rush of cold air spilled out, sharp and metallic, carrying with it the faint stench of decay. My flashlight beam caught the edges of the lid as it slid back, revealing a dark, hollow interior that seemed to stretch deeper than it should have. Shadows spilled out, curling and coiling like smoke, their movements deliberate and unnatural. The hum grew louder, the air vibrating with its intensity, and I felt the weight of the box pressing against my thoughts, unraveling the edges of my mind. From the shadows, something emerged. It wasn't solid, not entirely. Its form shifted and twisted, its edges sharp and fragmented, like a shattered reflection in broken glass. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, stretching toward the center of the room. The air grew colder, sharper, and I felt the weight of its presence pressing against my chest, suffocating. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment the thing seemed to vanish, its form dissolving into the shadows before reappearing closer, its jagged edges glinting faintly in the dim light. Callie screamed, her voice breaking as she stumbled back against the wall. The thing twisted toward her, its fragmented form coiling and shifting like smoke. My stomach turned as I saw the void where its face should have been. A hollow, pulsing darkness that seemed to draw in the light around it. "We have to go," Marcus said, grabbing my arm and pulling me back toward the doorway. His grip was tight, his breath ragged, and I could see the panic in his eyes, the raw, unfiltered fear that mirrored my own. No, who? But the doorway was gone. Elle, Lydia, moi. The wall that had held the door moments ago was now solid, its surface smooth and unbroken. The shadows had shifted, curling and twisting across the walls, their jagged edges forming patterns that pulsed faintly with the same sickly glow as the carvings on the box. My chest tightened as the realization sank in. We were trapped. The thing moved closer, its jagged form stretching and twisting, its movements deliberate and predatory. The air crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and I felt the weight of it pressing against me, suffocating. My legs refused to move, rooted to the ground by the sheer force of its presence. Henry shouted something, his voice raw and desperate, but I couldn't make out the words. The shadows were closing in, their movements sharp and erratic, and the thing surged forward, its fragmented form coiling around the box. The carvings flared brightly, their light searing into the darkness, and the room trembled violently, the floor splitting beneath our feet. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through my skull, and the last thing I saw was the jagged lines of the carvings twisting and writhing before everything went black. The blackness was suffocating, like being submerged in an ocean with no surface. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me, squeezing the air from my lungs. The hum had vanished, but its echo lingered in my skull, vibrating through my thoughts like a warning I couldn't escape. I wasn't sure if my eyes were open or closed until I saw the faintest flicker of light cutting through the dark. My flashlight. Its beam wavered weakly, illuminating a small circle of the floor in front of me. I was lying on my side, my cheek pressed against the cold stone, the texture rough and damp beneath my skin. My chest heaved as I pulled myself upright, my muscles trembling with the effort. The air was sharp and cold, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The room around me was unrecognizable, its walls jagged and uneven, as though the very foundation had shifted and twisted in on itself. The box was gone. So were the others. Callie. My voice cracked as I called out, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive stillness. Marcus, Henry, my throat was raw, each word scraping like sandpaper, and the silence that followed was worse than any answer I could have gotten. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else. A heavy, watchful stillness that pressed against my chest with every breath. The flashlight flickered again, its beam catching on a faint movement at the edge of the light. My heart lurched, and I swung the light toward it, my hands trembling. The shadows at the edge of the room twisted and writhed, their movements sharp and deliberate, but there was nothing there. At least, nothing I could see. I forced myself to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me as I tried to orient myself. The room had changed. The smooth walls of the mining office were gone, replaced by jagged stone that jutted out at unnatural angles. The air was damp, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere in the distance, a rhythmic, hollow tap that seemed to grow louder the longer I listened. I wasn't alone. I didn't see it at first, but I felt it. The weight of its presence pressing against my mind, cold and invasive. My flashlight trembled as I swung it across the room, the beam catching on something that made my stomach twist. At the far end of the room, where the shadows were thickest, a figure stood motionless, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. It wasn't human. Its jagged, fragmented edges shifted and flickered, as though it were made of broken glass caught in a faint breeze. Its limbs were long and angular, stretching unnaturally toward the floor, and the void where its face should have been pulsed faintly, emitting a sickly, rhythmic glow. The air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and I felt the hairs on my arms rise as the temperature plummeted. The thing didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, boring into me, peeling back the layers of my thoughts. My knees buckled under the weight of it, and I stumbled back, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly across the walls. The shadows twisted violently, coiling and stretching toward the thing, as though drawn to it, and I felt the faintest whisper crawl through my mind. My name. It wasn't spoken aloud. Eerie. It didn't need to be. The word pressed into my thoughts like a sharp needle, cold and deliberate, unraveling the edges of my mind. I stumbled back again, my breath catching in my throat as the thing took a step forward, its jagged form shifting and stretching with each movement. "Stop," I whispered, my voice trembling. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam sputtering, and the thing hesitated, its fragmented edges twitching as though unsure. The void at its center pulsed brighter, and the whispers in my head grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, each one cutting through my thoughts like broken glass. The floor beneath me trembled. The cracks that lined the stone spread outward, the jagged lines glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The air grew colder, sharper, and the thing surged forward, its movements sudden and violent. I turned and ran, my flashlight barely illuminating the uneven ground in front of me. The shadows clawed at my heels, and I could hear the faint sound of the thing behind me, its fragmented form scraping against the stone with a sound that made my teeth ache. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and narrowing with every step. My breaths were ragged, each one cutting into my chest like shards of glass. But I didn't stop. The whispers were louder now, pressing into my thoughts with a force that made it hard to think, to breathe. My flashlight beam flickered, and for a moment, the tunnel around me disappeared, replaced by jagged fragments of light and shadow that stretched into infinity. I stumbled, my foot catching on something that sent me sprawling to the ground. Hey, the ground. The flashlight skittered out of my grasp, its beam spinning wildly across the walls, before coming to rest on something ahead of me. Another figure. This one was different. It was smaller, hunched over, its form more human, but just as fragmented. The jagged edges of its body shifted and flickered, and its head snapped toward me, the void where its face should have been glowing faintly. I froze, my chest tightening as it began to crawl toward me, its movements sharp and erratic, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I scrambled backward, my hands scraping against the rough stone, and grabbed the flashlight. The beam caught the figure in its center, and it recoiled violently, its jagged limbs twitching and folding in on themselves. The glow at its core flickered, and for a moment, I thought it would disappear. But it didn't. It surged forward again, faster this time, the glow growing brighter. And I screamed, the sound tearing through the tunnel and echoing back at me. And then, from somewhere deeper in the mine, I heard an answer. The sound that answered me wasn't a scream. It was deeper, guttural, reverberating through the stone walls and into my chest. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a vibration that made the very air around me hum with tension. The crawling figure in front of me froze, its jagged form twitching as if caught in a current. The glow in its center pulsed faintly, matching the rhythm of the vibrations. And then it turned, folding into itself and dissolving into the shadows. The silence that followed was heavy, crushing, but it didn't last. The hum that had echoed through the tunnels returned, sharper and more deliberate, like a warning. I scrambled to my feet, gripping my flashlight tightly, its flickering beam barely cutting through the darkness ahead. The tunnel twisted sharply, its walls narrowing, and I had no choice but to move forward. The air grew colder with every step, sharp and metallic, filling my lungs with each shallow breath. The ground beneath me was uneven, shifting as though the earth itself were alive, and every step felt like a gamble. My flashlight caught glimpses of the jagged walls, their surfaces lined with faint carvings that seemed to shift and twist when I looked at them too long. The symbols were intricate, almost beautiful, but there was something deeply unsettling about their symmetry. They didn't feel random. They felt deliberate, like they were marking something, or warning me away. The hum grew louder. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a force, pressing against my chest and rattling in my skull. The carvings on the walls began to glow faintly, their jagged lines pulsing with a sickly green light. The shadows at the edges of the tunnel shifted, their movements sharp and erratic, and I could feel the weight of their gaze pressing against my back. My stomach churned as I moved forward, the walls around me seeming to close in with every step. The tunnel opened suddenly, spilling into a massive cavern that stretched impossibly high, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. The air was colder here, biting against my skin like needles, and the light from my flashlight barely reached the far edges of the space. At the center of the cavern stood a towering stone structure, its surface covered in the same intricate carvings that lined the tunnel walls. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the ground and into my chest, and the glow from the carvings pulsed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the jagged floor. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and felt the weight of the cavern pressing against me, suffocating. The stone structure was massive, its surface weathered and cracked, but its carvings were sharp and vivid, glowing faintly with the same sickly light. My flashlight beam caught on something near its base, and my breath hitched as I realized what it was. It was Marcus. He was slumped against the stone, his head tilted forward, his body unnaturally still. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me across the uneven ground, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The air grew colder as I approached, and the hum deepened, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. My voice caught in my throat as I reached him, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Marcus, wake up." His head snapped up. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam catching on his face. "I told you, they just dying to say." His eyes were wide and unblinking, glowing faintly with the same sickly light as the carvings on the stone behind him. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His expression blank and lifeless. The hum grew louder, sharper, and I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest, unraveling the edges of my thoughts. He stood slowly, his movements sharp and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. His glowing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought I saw something familiar in them, something human, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same hollow, empty gaze. The shadows in the cavern shifted violently, coiling and twisting, their movements sharp and deliberate. The carvings on the stone pulsed brighter, their light searing into the darkness, and the hum became a roar, vibrating through the ground and into my skull. Marcus stepped forward, his fragmented form twisting and shifting, and I felt the weight of his presence pressing against me, suffocating. "Marcus, stop," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Envelop," my voice breaking. My flashlight beam trembled as I swung it toward him, catching on the jagged edges of his form. The light seemed to push him back, his movements faltering. But it wasn't enough. He surged forward again, his jagged limbs stretching toward me, and I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the roar grew louder. The ground beneath me trembled violently, cracks spreading outward from the base of the stone structure. The glow from the carvings flared brighter, their jagged lines twisting and writhing, and the shadows surged forward, coiling around Marcus and dragging him back toward the stone. He didn't struggle. He didn't make a sound. His glowing eyes locked onto mine one last time. And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The roar stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like cotton, and I collapsed to my knees, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. The cavern was still now, the glow from the carvings fading slowly, their light pulsing faintly in time with the echo of my heartbeat. The shadows lingered at the edges of the space, their movements sharp and deliberate, and I felt their gaze pressing against me, cold and unrelenting. I wasn't alone. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, and I turned toward the stone structure, my flashlight beam catching on the jagged carvings that lined its surface. The glow pulsed brighter, and I felt the weight of something ancient and unspeakable pressing against me, unraveling the edges of my mind. The hum returned, deeper now, sharper, vibrating through the ground and into my chest, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cavern seemed alive, its jagged walls shifting in the faint, pulsing glow of the carvings. The air was sharp, metallic, carrying the faint scent of something ancient and decayed. My flashlight flickered as I staggered to my feet, the beam catching on the stone structure that loomed before me. Its surface was covered in carvings, symbols that writhed and twisted in the dim light, their jagged lines pulling at the edges of my thoughts. The silence was oppressive, heavy with a presence I couldn't see, but could feel pressing against my chest. My legs trembled as I moved closer to the structure, the ground beneath me uneven and cracked. Each step felt heavier, as though the very air around me was fighting to keep me in place. My flashlight beam flickered again, and I froze. Enobithus. There was something moving behind the stone. It wasn't Marcus. Not anymore. The fragmented figure that stepped into the light was taller, its jagged form twisting and stretching unnaturally. The void at its center pulsed faintly, a sickly glow that matched the rhythm of the carvings, and the air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric. My stomach churned as the thing moved closer, its angular limbs dragging across the stone with a sound that made my teeth ache. The hum returned, louder and sharper, vibrating through the cavern and rattling in my chest. The thing stopped just short of the stone structure, its jagged edges flickering like static. The shadows around it twisted violently, coiling and stretching as though drawn to its presence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The weight of the thing's gaze bore down on me, peeling back the layers of my thoughts, exposing fears I didn't know I had. Then it spoke. The sound wasn't words, not in any language I recognized. It was a vibration, a deep guttural resonance that pressed into my mind, filling it with fragmented images and emotions. The stone structure pulsed in response, its carvings glowing brighter, and the cracks in the ground spread outward, their jagged edges seeping faint trails of black liquid that hissed as it touched the air. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The light caught on the shadows at the edge of the cavern, their movements erratic and deliberate, and I realized with growing dread that the thing wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the darkness, their forms jagged and fragmented, their void-like centers pulsing faintly. They moved in unison, their sharp limbs dragging across the stone as they surrounded the structure. The hum deepened, the air vibrating with its intensity, and the carvings on the stone flared brightly, their light searing into the cavern. The figures stopped, their fragmented forms twitching as they turned toward the glow. The shadows around them coiled tighter, and I felt the weight of their presence pressing against me, suffocating. I didn't understand what they were doing, but I knew I had to stop it. My legs moved before I could think, carrying me toward the structure, my flashlight beam flickering weakly across the jagged floor. The hum grew louder with each step, the light from the carvings pulsing in time with its rhythm. The figures didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough to push against me, to unravel the edges of my thoughts. But I kept going. I reached the base of the structure, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. The carvings glowed brighter here, their jagged lines almost too vivid to look at. My hand trembled as I reached for the surface, the stone cold and rough beneath my fingertips. The hum seemed to vibrate through the structure, through me, and I felt the faintest flicker of something. Connection, understanding, before it was swallowed by the roar. The ground beneath me trembled violently, and the cracks widened, their jagged edges splitting open to reveal a faint pulsing light deep within the earth. The figures surrounding the structure turned toward me, their fragmented forms coiling and stretching, and the hum sharpened, cutting through the air like a blade. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I couldn't let them finish whatever they had started. I raised the flashlight, its beam trembling as it caught on the nearest figure. The light seemed to push it back, its jagged form flickering violently. But it didn't disappear. The void at its center pulsed brighter, and the shadows around it coiled tighter, their movements sharp and erratic. The hum became a roar, deafening and relentless, and the carvings on the stone flared so brightly I had to shield my eyes. The figures surged forward, their jagged limbs stretching toward me, and I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the air grew colder, sharper. The cracks in the ground widened, and the black liquid that seeped from them hissed and bubbled, filling the air with its acrid stench. I swung the flashlight wildly, its beam catching on the fragmented forms as they closed in. The light pushed them back, but only slightly, their movements slowing but never stopping. The shadows coiled tighter, their edges sharp and deliberate, and I felt the weight of their gaze pressing against me, suffocating. Then, from somewhere deep within the structure, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible beneath the roar. But it grew louder, sharper, until it cut through the air like a scream. The figures froze, their jagged forms twitching violently, and the light from the carvings flickered erratically, their glow dimming and flaring in time with the sound. The scream wasn't human. The stone beneath my feet trembled violently, and the cracks widened, their jagged edges splitting open to reveal something moving within the light. It wasn't just the earth shifting. It was something alive, something ancient and unspeakable. And it was waking up. The roar reached a deafening crescendo. And the last thing I saw before the light consumed everything was the jagged lines of the carvings twisting and writhing, their glow searing into the darkness. The light consumed everything, sharp and searing, piercing through the darkness of the cavern like a blade. It wasn't warm. Then it was cold, unnaturally so, and I felt it in my chest, in my head, in every cell of my body. The air itself seemed to shatter around me, and for a moment I thought I was falling, but the ground beneath me didn't move. I was rooted in place, trapped in the overwhelming glow as the roar filled every corner of my mind. When the light faded, the silence that followed was worse than the roar. It was heavy and sharp, pressing into my ears, into my chest, as though the cavern itself had swallowed all sound. I staggered back, my flashlight clutched tightly in my trembling hand, its beam flickering weakly across the jagged floor. The figures were gone, or at least I thought they were. The shadows still writhed at the edges of the cavern, but they felt less substantial now, thinner, like smoke dissipating in the wind. The stone structure loomed ahead, its carvings glowing faintly, their light dim and irregular. The cracks in the ground had widened, their jagged edges revealing a churning, pulsing light deep within the earth. It wasn't natural. It couldn't be. The glow was too vivid, too alive, and it shifted like a living thing, its edges sharp and fragmented. I forced myself forward, my legs trembling beneath me as I approached the structure. The air grew colder with every step, sharper, biting against my skin like needles. My breath hitched as I reached the base of the structure, my flashlight beam catching on the jagged carvings that lined its surface. The symbols seemed to twist and writhe in the light, their lines pulling at the edges of my thoughts, unraveling them like thread. Then I saw it. At the center of the structure, where the carvings converged into a chaotic spiral, was a single, jagged object. It was black, its surface smooth and reflective, and it pulsed faintly with the same sickly glow as the light beneath the cracks. It wasn't large, barely the size of my hand, but it radiated a presence that made my stomach churn, my chest tighten. The hum returned, low and resonant, vibrating through the structure and into my bones, and I felt the weight of the object pressing against me, unraveling the edges of my mind. I reached for it without thinking, my hand trembling as it hovered over the jagged surface. The moment my fingers brushed against it, the hum sharpened, cutting through the air like a blade. The carvings flared brightly, their light searing into the cavern, and I stumbled back, clutching the object tightly in my hand. The shadows surged forward. They weren't formless anymore. They had shape, jagged and fragmented, their movements sharp and deliberate. Their void-like centers pulsed faintly, and the air around them crackled with energy, sharp and electric. They moved as one, coiling and twisting toward the structure, their jagged limbs stretching toward me. The hum deepened, vibrating through the ground and into my chest, and I felt the weight of the object in my hand pressing against me, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't just an object. It was alive, and it was feeding on me. My knees buckled under the weight of it, and I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the ground as the shadows closed in. Then I heard the voice. It wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. It pressed into my mind like a cold needle, sharp and deliberate, filling every corner of my thoughts. And it wasn't a language I understood, but the meaning was clear. It was you are. Release it. I shook my head, clutching the object tighter, its surface cold and smooth beneath my fingers. The shadows coiled tighter, their movements sharp and erratic, and the hum grew louder, sharper, cutting through the air like a scream. The ground beneath me trembled violently, and the cracks widened, the light within them flaring brightly, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The voice came again, louder this time, its weight pressing against my chest, my mind. Release it. I couldn't. I didn't know what it was, didn't know what it wanted, but I knew that letting it go would mean something worse. The cavern trembled around me, the jagged walls shifting, and the shadows surged forward, their fragmented forms twisting and stretching. The hum became a roar, deafening and relentless, and the object in my hand pulsed brighter, its light searing into the darkness. And then it stopped. The roar, the hum, the tremors, everything stopped. The shadows froze, their jagged forms twitching, and the light from the cracks dimmed, its glow pulsing faintly. The cavern was still, the silence sharp and suffocating, and I felt the weight of the object pressing against me, cold and unrelenting. The voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. Release it. I opened my hand. The object hovered above my palm, its jagged surface glowing faintly, and the carvings on the stone structure pulsed in response. The shadows shifted, their movements slower, more deliberate, and the light from the cracks flared brightly, casting sharp, angular patterns across the walls. The object began to dissolve, its edges fractured, breaking apart into jagged shards that twisted and writhed before dissolving into the air. The carvings on the structure flared brightly, their light searing into the cavern, and the hum returned, sharper and louder, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. The shadows recoiled, their fragmented forms twisting violently, and I felt the weight of the cavern pressing against me, suffocating. And then the light went out. The darkness that followed was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a void, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin, my chest, my thoughts. I reached for the flashlight at my side, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. The beam flickered weakly when I turned it on, its light barely cutting through the oppressive blackness around me. The cavern was different now. The jagged walls had shifted, Their once sharp edges now warped and uneven, as though the very fabric of the space had been twisted and stretched. The cracks in the ground had widened, their jagged lines cutting deep into the stone, and the faint glow that had once pulsed within them was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The air was sharp and metallic, heavy with a cold that sank into my bones. The object was gone. The weight of it, the cold presence that had pressed against my mind, was replaced by something worse, an emptiness that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The silence was deafening, heavy and absolute, as though the cavern itself were holding its breath. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, as I scanned the space with the flashlight. The beam caught on the stone structure at the center of the cavern, its surface now cracked and fractured, the carvings that once glowed so vividly now dark and lifeless. It looked ancient and fragile, as though a single touch would send it crumbling to the ground. I wasn't alone. I felt it before I saw it. The weight of its presence pressing against me, cold and unrelenting. The shadows at the edges of the cavern began to move, their jagged forms shifting and coiling like smoke. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swung it toward them, the beam catching on something sharp and angular. It was one of the figures. Its fragmented form stood motionless at first, its jagged edges flickering faintly in the weak light. The void where its face should have been pulsed faintly, and the air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric. It moved suddenly, its limbs twitching and shifting as it stepped toward me, its movements sharp and deliberate. The flashlight's beam flickered, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding against my ribs. The shadows around the figure shifted, coiling and twisting, their movements sharp and erratic. The thing stopped, just short of the fractured stone structure, its jagged limbs reaching toward the cracks in the ground. The roar returned. It was deeper this time, a guttural vibration that shook the cavern and pressed against my chest. The shadows surged forward, their movements chaotic, and the cracks in the ground began to glow faintly, their jagged edges seeping trails of black liquid that hissed and bubbled as it touched the air. The stone structure trembled violently, its carvings flickering weakly, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. I turned to run, but the shadows closed in, their jagged edges stretching toward me, cutting off any path of escape. The roar grew louder, sharper, and the fractured stone structure flared brightly, its light searing into the cavern. The figures recoiled, their fragmented forms twisting violently. But they didn't disappear. They coiled around the structure, their jagged limbs reaching toward the cracks, and I felt the weight of their gaze pressing against me, cold and suffocating. The voice returned. It was softer now, almost a whisper, pressing into my mind with the same cold, deliberate force. You let it out. The words cut through the roar, filling every corner of my thoughts, and I felt my knees buckle beneath the weight of them. The carvings on the stone flared brighter, their light twisting and writhing, and the cracks in the ground widened, the faint glow within them pulsing erratically. The voice came again, sharper this time, its weight pressing harder against my thoughts. You can't stop it. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand, its beam flickering weakly across the jagged floor. The shadows surged forward, their movements erratic, and the roar became deafening, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. The light from the stone structure flared one last time, blinding and searing, and the cracks beneath it split open, releasing a torrent of black, pulsing energy that shot upward, twisting and coiling like smoke. The cavern collapsed. The ground beneath me gave way, and I fell, the flashlight slipping from my grasp as the roar filled my ears, sharp and endless. The air was cold and sharp, cutting against my skin as I tumbled through the darkness, the jagged walls of the cavern rushing past me. My chest tightened, my lungs burning as the air was ripped from them, and I felt the faintest flicker of light, then nothing. When I opened my eyes, the world was still. The cavern was gone, replaced by a jagged, barren landscape that stretched endlessly into the darkness. The air was cold and sharp, heavy with the metallic tang of iron, and the ground beneath me was uneven and cracked, its surface glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The shadows were everywhere, their jagged forms coiling and twisting at the edges of the light, their movements sharp and deliberate. The voice came again, faint but deliberate. You are part of it now. Endus tade main. The words sank into my chest, cold and unrelenting, and I realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. The roar had stopped, but the hum remained, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground and into my thoughts. The light from the cracks dimmed, pulsing faintly, and the shadows surged forward, their jagged edges reaching toward me. I wasn't alone, but I wasn't myself anymore either. The forest opened abruptly, the dense tangle of trees giving way to an expanse of overgrown grass and decaying buildings. Hollow Creek stood before us, its crumbling structures slouched against the mountain's base, cloaked in a silence so absolute it felt wrong. I stopped at the edge of the tree line, my breath catching as I took in the sight. The town didn't look real. It was too still, too lifeless, like a photograph left to fade under the weight of time. The others stood just behind me, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The weight of the place pressed down on us, an unspoken heaviness that made the air hard to breathe. I stepped forward, my boots crunching against the brittle weeds, and the sound seemed too loud, an intrusion in a place that hadn't known noise in decades. The wind was absent, the air thick and heavy, and the sun seemed dimmer here, its light struggling to break through the oppressive gray sky. The first building we passed was a general store, its windows shattered, and its door hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. The sign above it was faded, the words barely legible beneath the layers of grime and weathered paint. I caught a glimpse of shelves inside, their contents long gone, replaced by shadows that seemed to move as my flashlight beam flickered over them. The silence wrapped tighter around me, the kind that wasn't just quiet but void. Something that erased the normal sounds of the world. The map had brought us here. We'd found it 2 days earlier, tucked into the pages of an old trail guide that no one in our group remembered bringing. Its edges were frayed, the ink faded but readable, with a hand-drawn trail that led straight to Hollow Creek. Curiosity had driven us forward, despite the whispers we'd heard about the place. Stories of disappearances, of a curse that lingered like smoke in the air. Standing here now, I wondered why none of us had turned back. The whispers began faintly, so soft. I thought I was imagining them. They slid through the silence, curling at the edges of my thoughts, pulling me toward the center of town. The others must have heard it too. I could see it in their expressions, the tension in their bodies as they moved closer together. My flashlight's beam wavered across the street, catching the faint glint of something metallic near the ground. I crouched, brushing away the dirt, and revealed a small, rusted plaque embedded in the earth. The words were almost illegible, but one phrase stood out. To those who dared dig too deep. A chill ran down my spine, and I stood quickly, my heart pounding against my ribs. The map had marked this place with a small X, but it hadn't explained why. The faint whispers grew louder, more insistent, threading through the air like a warning or a lure. My hands shook as I adjusted my flashlight, sweeping the beam toward the largest building in the distance. It stood taller than the others, its silhouette jagged against the dim sky. The sign above the door was broken, but a single word was etched into the wood. Office. Office. We moved as one, drawn to the building despite the growing weight in the air. The ground beneath my boots felt soft, wrong, as though the earth had given up, trying to support the structures that clung to it. The door creaked as we pushed it open, the sound splitting the silence like a scream. Anyway, inside, the air was colder, sharper, carrying the faint, metallic tang of decay. My flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating the remnants of a desk, scattered papers, and a map pinned to the far wall. The map was different from the one we'd followed here. Its lines were thicker, darker, etched into the paper as though carved with a knife. It showed the layout of the mine that stretched beneath the town, its tunnels winding like veins through the mountain. At the center of the map was a mark, a black spiral that seemed to pulse faintly under the beam of my flashlight. My breath hitched as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. But before I could touch it, the whispers stopped. The silence was immediate, absolute. It pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts, leaving behind an emptiness that made my skin crawl. I turned to the others, their faces pale and tense, but before I could speak, a sound broke through the stillness, a low, rhythmic tapping, faint but deliberate, coming from beneath the floor. The tapping grew louder, sharper, until it reverberated through the walls and into my chest. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get out. My flashlight beam darted across the room, landing on a trapdoor near the corner. The wood was splintered and darkened with age, the edges marked with deep scratches that dug into the floorboards. I moved toward it, the others following close behind, their breaths shallow and uneven. My hand hovered over the rusted handle, the cold metal biting into my palm as I gripped it and pulled. The trapdoor groaned as it opened, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the darkness. The air that wafted up was colder, sharper, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic. The whispers returned. They weren't faint anymore. They were louder, sharper, filling the room with their overlapping tones. They didn't come from the mine below. They came from the walls, the floor, the very air around us. My chest tightened as I stepped onto the first stair, the old wood creaking beneath my weight. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the jagged walls of the tunnel below. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a deep, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the air, through my chest, through my thoughts. The descent was slow, the stairs narrow and uneven, and the hum grew louder with every step. The others followed, their flashlights trembling as they cast jagged shadows against the walls. The tunnel twisted and narrowed, its walls slick with moisture, and the air grew colder, sharper, cutting into my lungs with every breath. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel opened into a small cavern, its walls covered in jagged carvings that pulsed faintly with a sickly green light. At the center of the room was an object, a small black stone, its surface smooth and reflective. The hum emanated from it, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that clawed at the edges of my thoughts. And then the light went out. The darkness wasn't empty. It pressed against me, thick and suffocating, wrapping around my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam sputtering in and out, casting fleeting glimpses of the cavern around me. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their green glow fading like a heartbeat, slowly giving out. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the air, through the floor, through my very thoughts. I could feel it in my chest, sharp and cold, rattling my ribs and sinking deep into my mind. My hand tightened around the flashlight, the metal slick with sweat as I swung the beam toward the center of the cavern. The stone was still there, its surface glinting faintly in the flickering light. It sat motionless, but it felt alive, its presence filling the room like a cold, malevolent force. The others were behind me. I could hear their shallow breaths, their footsteps hesitant against the uneven floor. Callie's voice broke the silence, sharp and trembling. "Do you feel that?" she asked, though the question felt pointless. We all felt it. How could we not? It was everywhere, pressing against us, digging into the cracks of our minds like ice, spreading through a fractured window. The whispers returned, faint at first, curling at the edges of my thoughts like smoke. They weren't words, not in any language I recognized, but I understood them all the same. They pulled at me, sharp and insistent, urging me forward toward the stone. My legs moved before I could stop them, my body obeying an instinct that wasn't mine. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I stepped closer, the air growing colder with every step. Behind me, Marcus muttered something under his breath, his voice low and unsteady. "Don't touch it," he said, though it sounded more like a plea than a command. His flashlight's beam darted across the walls, catching on the jagged carvings that seemed to twist and writhe in the flickering light. The green glow pulsed brighter, sharper, and the hum deepened, resonating through the cavern like a low guttural growl. The stone called to me. Its surface was smooth, reflective and wrong, like a shard of something that didn't belong in this world. A shard of something that didn't belong in this world. My hand trembled as I reached for it, my fingers brushing against its cold surface. The moment I touched it, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a void, erasing every sound except the pounding of my heart. My chest tightened as the hum grew sharper, slicing through the silence like a blade. And then it moved. The stone trembled beneath my fingers, its surface rippling like liquid, before solidifying again. The glow from the carvings flared brightly, searing into my eyes, and the shadows around the edges of the cavern surged forward, their jagged forms coiling and twisting like living things. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam catching on the walls as the shadows stretched toward me, their movements sharp and deliberate. The hum became a roar. And it wasn't just a sound, it was a force, vibrating through the cavern, through the air, through my chest. The ground beneath me trembled violently, cracks spreading outward from the base of the stone. The jagged carvings on the walls pulsed erratically, their glow flickering like a dying flame. And I felt the weight of the stone pressing against my mind, unraveling the edges of my thoughts. Callie screamed, her voice cutting through the roar as she stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the ground. The shadows surged toward her, their jagged edges glinting faintly in the weak light. I reached for her, my hand grasping at empty air as she was dragged into the darkness, her scream echoing through the cavern before abruptly cutting off. The silence returned, heavier than before, broken only by the faint hum that lingered like a warning. My flashlight beam trembled as I swung it toward the spot where Callie had stood moments ago, but there was nothing there. No sign of her, no trace that she'd ever been there at all. Marcus grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice cracking. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his face pale, and I could see the fear in him, raw and unfiltered. The hum grew louder, sharper, and I felt the weight of the stone pressing against me, pulling me toward it, even as every instinct screamed to run. The cavern shifted around us, the walls narrowing, the shadows stretching and coiling like smoke. The carvings pulsed brighter, their jagged lines twisting and writhing, and the cracks in the ground widened, revealing a faint, pulsing light deep within the earth. The hum became a roar again, vibrating through the floor and into my chest, and I felt the air around me grow colder, sharper, cutting against my skin like needles. I turned and ran. The tunnel twisted sharply, its walls closing in as I stumbled forward, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly across the jagged floor. Marcus was behind me, his breaths ragged and uneven, his footsteps echoing faintly through the narrow passage. The hum followed us, low and guttural, pressing against my thoughts like a vice, and I could feel the shadows closing in, their jagged forms flickering at the edges of the light. The air grew heavier with every step, the walls of the tunnel pressing tighter, the ground beneath me uneven and slick. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment the darkness consumed everything, the hum filling the void like a presence, cold and suffocating. When the beam returned, the tunnel had changed, its jagged walls lined with carvings that pulsed faintly, their light dim and irregular. The hum deepened, sharper now, vibrating through the floor and into my chest, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it wasn't over. It had never been over. The tunnel twisted endlessly, its jagged walls narrowing with every step. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. The hum was omnipresent now, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the very air around me. It pressed against my chest, my skull, my thoughts growing sharper with each passing second. Marcus was behind me, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but neither of us spoke. Words felt useless here, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the tunnel. The air was different, thicker, colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. My flashlight's beam caught on the carvings that lined the walls, their jagged lines pulsing faintly in time with the hum. The symbols seemed to shift as I moved, their patterns twisting and warping in ways that made my head ache. I tore my gaze away, focusing on the uneven ground beneath my feet. But the feeling lingered, a faint insidious pressure at the back of my mind. A faint sound echoed from deeper within the tunnel, soft at first, but growing louder. It wasn't the hum, it was sharper, rhythmic, like the distant scrape of metal against stone. My pulse quickened as I swung my flashlight toward the source, the beam trembling as it illuminated the dark ahead. The tunnel stretched on, empty and lifeless, but the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. Marcus grabbed my arm, his grip trembling. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum. I nodded, my throat too tight to form words. "Envizira, Salem, on Avziwan, and could too, tight." The sound was wrong, not just unnatural but deliberate, like it was meant to be heard. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself forward, each step heavier than the last. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their jagged lines searing into the darkness, and the air grew colder, biting against my skin like needles. The tunnel opened suddenly into a cavern, its vast, uneven walls disappearing into the darkness above. The air here was colder, sharper, and the hum resonated more deeply, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. My flashlight beam flickered across the cavern, catching on the jagged edges of broken stone and rusted machinery. The remnants of the mine were scattered across the floor, their twisted forms warped and decayed, as though they had been left to rot for decades. At the center of the cavern was a massive pit, its edges jagged and uneven, as though the ground had been torn apart. The light from my flashlight couldn't reach the bottom, disappearing into the void below. The hum was louder here, a sharp, guttural resonance that made my teeth ache. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their light casting jagged shadows across the cavern. Marcus stepped closer to the pit, his flashlight beam darting across the broken stone. "What is this place?" he muttered, his voice trembling. He didn't expect an answer, and I didn't have one to give. The pit felt alive, its presence pressing against me, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. I took a step back, the weight of it too much to bear. But Marcus moved closer, his gaze fixed on the darkness below. Then the whispers returned. They came from the pit, soft at first, curling at the edges of my thoughts, like smoke. They weren't words, not in any language I understood, but they carried meaning all the same, pulling me toward the edge. My legs moved on their own, drawn by an instinct that wasn't mine, and I felt the cold bite of the void pressing against my chest as I peered into the darkness below. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that clawed at the edges of my mind. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their jagged lines twisting and writhing, and the air grew colder, sharper, as though the cavern itself were alive. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving within the pit, a faint, jagged shape that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Marcus stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering against the stone. "Endeli," the sound echoed through the cavern, sharp and deafening, and the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt alive. My chest tightened as the hum deepened, sharper now, vibrating through the ground and into my skull. Then I saw it. It emerged from the pit slowly, its form jagged and fragmented, like a reflection shattered into 1,000 pieces. Its limbs were long and angular, stretching unnaturally as it pulled itself upward, its movements sharp and deliberate. The void where its face should have been pulsed faintly, a sickly green light that matched the glow of the carvings on the walls. The air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and I felt the weight of its presence pressing against me, cold and unrelenting. Marcus screamed, his voice raw and desperate, as the thing turned toward him, its fragmented limbs twisting and shifting. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam trembling as it caught on the jagged edges of its form. Eerie, police. The shadows around it coiled tighter, their movements sharp and erratic, and the hum became a roar, deafening and relentless, vibrating through the cavern and into my chest. The thing surged forward, its jagged limbs stretching toward Marcus, and he stumbled, his foot catching on a broken piece of stone. He fell hard, his head striking the ground with a sickening crack, and the flashlight slipped from his grasp, its beam flickering weakly across the cavern. The thing didn't stop. All moving didn't stop. It moved over him, its fragmented form, coiling and twisting, and I heard the faintest whisper escape his lips before the shadows consumed him. The roar stopped. The cavern was silent, the hum fading into a faint rhythmic pulse that matched the pounding of my heart. The thing turned toward me, its jagged form shifting, and I felt its gaze pressing against me, cold and unrelenting. My legs refused to move, rooted to the ground by the sheer weight of its presence, and I felt the edges of my thoughts unraveling, pulled apart by the void at its center. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it disappeared. The cavern was empty, the shadows retreating to the edges of the light, their movements slow and deliberate. The hum lingered, faint and insistent, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it wasn't over. It had never been over. The cavern was still, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam weak and flickering as it swept over the jagged walls. The carvings, once faintly glowing, now seemed dormant, their edges rough and cold. Marcus was gone. The shadows had taken him, consumed him, and yet the air still felt heavy with his presence, like a whisper that wouldn't fade. I stood frozen at the edge of the pit, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The thing that had emerged from the darkness had vanished, its fragmented form dissolving into the void. But I could still feel it, watching, waiting. The hum lingered, faint but insistent, vibrating through the stone beneath my feet, a reminder that the danger hadn't passed. I forced myself to move, every muscle in my body screaming against the effort. My legs felt weak, like they didn't belong to me anymore. But I couldn't stay here. The cavern was wrong, its air thick and cold, its shadows too alive. I stumbled forward, away from the pit, my flashlight beam darting across the uneven ground as I searched for an exit. The walls seemed to close in around me, their jagged edges casting long, twisted shadows that danced in the flickering light. A faint noise echoed through the cavern, sharp and rhythmic, like the tapping of metal against stone. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and swung the flashlight toward the sound. The beam illuminated a narrow passage at the far end of the cavern, its entrance jagged and uneven, like it had been torn open rather than carved. The sound was coming from there, faint but deliberate, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. I didn't want to go, but my feet moved anyway, drawn forward by an invisible force. The passage was narrow, the walls close enough to brush against my shoulders as I made my way through. The air grew colder, sharper, and the tapping grew louder, its rhythm erratic, like it was trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but no less unsettling. The walls were lined with carvings, their jagged lines pulsing faintly in the dim light. At the center of the room was a massive stone structure, its surface cracked and weathered, its edges sharp and uneven. The hum was louder here, resonating through the air, through my chest, and the tapping was coming from behind it, faint but insistent. I approached the structure cautiously, my flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated its surface. The carvings here were different, more intricate, more deliberate. They didn't just line the stone, they covered it completely, twisting and overlapping in a chaotic spiral that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. My chest tightened as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold surface, and the hum deepened, vibrating through the stone and into my bones. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was immediate, absolute. It pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts, erasing every sound except the pounding of my heart. I stepped back, my flashlight beam darting across the chamber. But there was nothing, no shadows, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the room. And then the stone moved. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor that rippled through its surface, but it grew stronger, the cracks widening, the carvings glowing brighter. The hum became a roar, sharp and guttural, vibrating through the ground and into my chest, and the air around me crackled with energy, sharp and electric. The shadows at the edges of the chamber coiled tighter, their movements sharp and erratic, and I felt the weight of the stone pressing against me, unraveling the edges of my thoughts. The cracks in the stone spread outward, their jagged edges glowing with a sickly green light. The carvings twisted and writhed, their lines shifting and overlapping, and the roar grew louder, sharper, cutting through the air like a blade. The ground beneath me trembled violently, and I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the ground as I fell. From the center of the stone, something emerged. It wasn't the same as the thing I'd seen in the first cavern. This was larger, its fragmented form twisting and coiling, its jagged edges glinting faintly in the sickly light. The void at its center pulsed brighter, sharper, and the air around it grew colder, sharper, cutting against my skin like needles. The hum deepened, vibrating through the chamber, and I felt the weight of its gaze pressing against me, peeling back the layers of my mind. I scrambled back, my hands scraping against the rough stone, and reached for the flashlight, its beam trembling as I swung it toward the thing. The light caught on its jagged edges, and it recoiled slightly, its movements sharp and erratic. The shadows around it surged forward, coiling and twisting, their jagged forms stretching toward me. I tried to scream, but the air was gone, the weight of the thing pressing against my chest, my mind, my soul. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their light searing into the darkness, and the roar reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the ground and into my skull. The shadows closed in, their jagged edges glinting faintly in the sickly light, and I felt the air around me grow colder, sharper, as the thing surged forward. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the jagged lines of the carvings twisting and writhing, their glow flaring brightly before fading into nothingness. The darkness was suffocating, alive, pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. The roar had stopped, but the hum remained, vibrating faintly in the silence, a constant reminder of the thing I had seen, the thing that had seen me. My flashlight flickered weakly in my trembling hand, its beam barely piercing the void around me. I couldn't tell if the chamber had changed or if my senses were unraveling, but the space felt smaller, the air heavier, the walls closer. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body screaming against the effort. My legs were weak, trembling beneath me, but I couldn't stay here. The weight of the hum pressed against my chest, suffocating, and the faint glow of the carvings on the walls pulsed like a heartbeat, irregular and raw. I stumbled forward, my footsteps uneven on the jagged ground, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The shadows were still there. They lingered at the edges of the light, coiling and twisting, their movements slow but deliberate. They were waiting, watching, their jagged forms shifting with a quiet, predatory patience. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one sharp and painful. But I kept moving, my flashlight beam darting across the walls, searching for an exit. The carvings pulsed brighter as I moved, their jagged lines twisting and writhing in the flickering light. The hum deepened, sharper now, resonating through the ground, through my chest, through my thoughts. I couldn't think, couldn't focus, the weight of it pressing against me, unraveling the edges of my mind. I stumbled, my foot catching on a broken piece of stone, and fell hard, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering against the ground. The beam spun wildly, catching on the jagged carvings, the twisted shadows, and something else, something moving. It was one of the figures. Its jagged, fragmented form stepped into the light, its movements sharp and deliberate, its void-like center pulsing faintly. The air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and I felt the weight of its presence pressing against me, cold and unrelenting. It didn't move toward me, not yet. It just stood there, watching, waiting, its jagged limbs twitching slightly as though testing the air. I reached for the flashlight, my hand trembling as I gripped the cold metal and swung the beam toward the thing. The light caught it full in the center, and it recoiled slightly, its fragmented edges flickering violently. But it didn't retreat. It didn't disappear. Oh, it stood its ground, its jagged form twisting and coiling, its movements sharper now, more erratic. The shadows around it surged forward, their jagged edges stretching toward the light, and I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the air grew colder, sharper. The hum became a roar again, deafening and relentless, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. The carvings on the walls flared brightly, their light searing into the darkness, and the shadows closed in, their movements faster, more deliberate. The thing stepped forward, its jagged limbs stretching toward me, and I felt the weight of its presence pressing against my chest, suffocating. I turned and ran. The tunnel twisted sharply, its walls narrowing as I stumbled forward, the beam of my flashlight darting wildly across the jagged floor. The roar followed me, sharp and guttural, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through my skull. The walls seemed to shift and twist around me, their jagged edges casting long, jagged shadows that danced in the flickering light. The air grew colder with every step, sharper, heavier, and I could feel the thing behind me, its fragmented form stretching and coiling, its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. The tunnel opened into another chamber, larger this time, its walls lined with the same jagged carvings that pulsed faintly in the dim light. At the center of the room was another structure, its surface cracked and weathered, its edges sharp and uneven. The hum deepened as I stepped inside, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through my chest, and I felt the weight of the structure pressing against me, unraveling the edges of my thoughts. The shadows were faster now, their jagged forms darting across the room, coiling and twisting as they closed in. I swung the flashlight wildly, its beam catching on the jagged carvings, the twisted shadows, and the thing that had followed me, the thing that was still there, its jagged fragmented form standing at the edge of the light, watching, waiting. The roar grew louder, sharper, vibrating through the room, through my chest, through my thoughts, and I felt the air grow heavier, the walls closer, the shadows darker. The carvings flared brightly, their light searing into the room, and the thing surged forward, its jagged limbs stretching toward me, its void-like center pulsing brighter. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The air was gone, the weight of the thing pressing against my chest, my mind, my soul. The shadows closed in, their jagged edges glinting faintly in the flickering light, and the roar became deafening, vibrating through the room, through the ground, through my skull. And then the light went out. The darkness didn't feel empty. It was alive, pressing against me with a weight I couldn't escape. The roar had faded, but the hum lingered, vibrating faintly in the suffocating silence. I tried to move, but my body felt paralyzed, my limbs heavy as though bound by invisible chains. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, the cold biting deep into my lungs, the sharp metallic tang filling my senses. The flashlight lay somewhere out of reach, its weak glow extinguished in the chaos. Envelop and chaos. I was alone in the void, but I could feel them, watching. The shadows didn't need eyes to see me. Their presence pressed against my skin, my mind, suffocating me with their silent, unrelenting weight. The hum deepened, resonating through the ground beneath me, and I felt the jagged stone scrape against my palms as I struggled to push myself upright. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed in the distance. No, Kaya, they seek. It was sharp, deliberate, cutting through the silence like a needle through fabric. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once, pulling at the edges of my thoughts, unraveling them thread by thread. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and turned toward the source of the sound, though I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The tapping grew louder, closer, and the air around me thickened, pressing against my chest like a hand squeezing the breath from my lungs. I stumbled forward, my arms outstretched, my fingers brushing against the jagged walls of the tunnel. The carvings were cold beneath my touch, their sharp edges biting into my skin. But I didn't care. I had to move. I had to get out. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening, the absence of sound louder than the roar that had come before. Then the hum returned, sharper this time, vibrating through the ground, through the walls, through me. The carvings on the walls flared to life, their jagged lines pulsing with a sickly green light that cast twisted shadows across the tunnel. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I turned toward the source of the light. It was back. The thing stood at the far end of the tunnel, its jagged, fragmented form illuminated by the glow of the carvings. Its void-like center pulsed faintly, and the air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric. It didn't move, but its presence pressed against me, cold and unrelenting, peeling back the layers of my thoughts like paper burned at the edges. I stumbled back, my hands scraping against the jagged walls, and the shadows coiled tighter, their movements sharp and deliberate. The thing took a step forward, its angular limbs shifting and twisting, and the hum deepened, resonating through the ground, through my chest, through my mind. My heart pounded against my ribs as I turned and ran, my legs trembling beneath me, the air growing colder. With every step, the tunnel twisted and narrowed, its jagged walls closing in, the carvings pulsing brighter as the hum grew louder. The shadows followed, their jagged forms coiling and twisting, and I could hear the faint scrape of the thing's limbs against the stone, its fragmented edges glinting faintly in the flickering light. My chest tightened as the air grew heavier, sharper, cutting into my lungs with every breath. The tunnel opened abruptly into another chamber, larger than the last, its walls lined with the same jagged carvings that pulsed faintly in the dim light. At the center of the room was another stone structure, its surface cracked and weathered, its edges sharp and uneven. The hum deepened as I stepped inside, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through my chest, and I felt the weight of the structure pressing against me, unraveling the edges of my thoughts. The thing was behind me. Its presence filled the room, pressing against me with an unrelenting weight that made it hard to breathe, to think. The shadows surged forward, their jagged forms coiling and twisting, and the carvings flared brighter, their light searing into the darkness. The thing stepped into the light, its fragmented limbs shifting and twisting, its void-like center pulsing brighter, sharper. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and my hand brushed against the edge of the stone structure. The carvings on its surface twisted and writhed, their jagged lines glowing faintly, and the hum deepened, resonating through the room. The shadows closed in, their movements faster, more deliberate, and I felt the weight of the thing pressing against my chest, suffocating. I reached for the carvings, my fingers tracing their jagged edges, and the hum sharpened, cutting through the air like a blade. The carvings flared brightly, their light twisting and writhing, and the shadows recoiled, their jagged forms flickering violently. The thing hesitated, its movements erratic, and I felt a flicker of hope, fragile and fleeting, as the light from the carvings seared into the darkness. The hum became a roar, deafening and relentless, vibrating through the room, through the ground, through my skull. The carvings twisted and writhed, their jagged lines overlapping, and the light flared brighter, sharper, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The thing surged forward, its jagged limbs stretching toward me, its void-like center pulsing brighter. I didn't scream. Mine, the air was gone, the weight of the thing pressing against my chest, my mind, my soul. The shadows closed in, their jagged edges glinting faintly in the flickering light, and the roar reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the room, through the ground, through my skull. And then the light went out. The light vanished, and with it all sense of direction. I stood suspended in an endless void, the hum now an omnipresent force that pulsed through the air, ground, and my thoughts. My breathing was ragged, each gasp cutting through my chest like shards of ice. The darkness wasn't empty, it was alive, shifting and writhing, pressing against me with a suffocating weight. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against the jagged walls of the tunnel. Ah, the carvings were still there, cold and sharp, their edges biting into my skin as I traced their lines. They pulsed faintly beneath my touch, an irregular rhythm that matched the hum vibrating in my skull. My flashlight was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos, and the void around me felt like it was closing in, pressing tighter with each passing second. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of decay. I tried to move, my legs trembling beneath me, but the ground felt uneven, shifting like it was alive. Each step was a gamble, the darkness threatening to swallow me whole. The hum deepened, sharper now, slicing through the silence like a blade. My chest tightened as I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched, searching for anything solid, anything real. The shadows weren't just lingering anymore. They were moving. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, coiling and twisting at the edges of my mind. Their presence was heavy, unrelenting, like they were peeling back the layers of my thoughts, exposing everything I didn't want to see. My legs buckled, and I fell hard, the jagged stone scraping against my palms as I hit the ground. The hum grew louder, sharper, resonating through the air, through the ground, through my chest. And then I heard it, a voice, not spoken aloud, but pressed into my thoughts like a needle threading through fabric. It was faint at first, a whisper, curling at the edges of my mind, but it grew louder, sharper, until it filled every corner of my consciousness. The words weren't in any language I understood, but their meaning was clear, carved into my thoughts like the jagged lines on the walls. You shouldn't be here. My breath caught, my chest tightening as the words sank into me, cold and deliberate. I scrambled to my feet, my hands trembling as I pressed them against the walls, the carvings pulsing beneath my touch. The hum sharpened, vibrating through the ground, and the shadows surged forward, their movements sharp and erratic. The voice came again, louder this time, its weight pressing against my thoughts, unraveling them thread by thread. You woke it up. The shadows coiled tighter, their jagged forms stretching toward me, and the hum became a roar, deafening and relentless. The ground beneath me trembled violently, the cracks spreading outward like veins, their jagged edges glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The carvings on the walls flared brightly, their twisted lines searing into the darkness, and I felt the air around me grow colder, sharper, cutting into my skin like needles. The roar reached a crescendo, vibrating through the ground and into my skull, and I stumbled back, my chest tightening as the air grew heavier, suffocating. The light from the carvings twisted and writhed, casting jagged shadows across the walls. And I saw it again, the thing that had followed me, the thing that had been waiting. Its jagged, fragmented form emerged from the void, its movements sharp and deliberate, its void-like center pulsing brighter with every step. The air around it crackled with energy, sharp and electric, and I felt the weight of its presence pressing against me, peeling back the layers of my thoughts, unraveling them until there was nothing left. I turned and ran. The tunnel twisted and narrowed, its jagged walls closing in as I stumbled forward, the ground shifting beneath my feet. The roar followed me, sharp and guttural, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through my chest. The shadows were faster now, their jagged forms coiling and twisting, their movements deliberate and predatory. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The tunnel opened abruptly into a massive cavern, its walls lined with the same jagged carvings that pulsed faintly in the dim light. At the center of the cavern was a massive, jagged structure, its surface cracked and weathered, its edges sharp and uneven. The hum deepened as I stepped inside, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through my chest, and I felt the weight of the structure pressing against me, suffocating. The shadows surged forward, their movements faster, more deliberate, and the roar became deafening, vibrating through the room, through the ground, through my skull. The carvings flared brightly, their light searing into the darkness, and the thing stepped into the light, its jagged, fragmented form coiling and twisting, its void-like center pulsing brighter, sharper. I reached for the carvings, my fingers tracing their jagged edges, and the hum sharpened, cutting through the air like a blade. The carvings twisted and writhed beneath my touch, their jagged lines glowing brighter, and the shadows recoiled, their movements sharp and erratic. The thing hesitated, its fragmented limbs twitching violently, and I felt the weight of the cavern pressing against me, unraveling the edges of my mind. The roar became a scream, deafening and relentless, and the carvings flared one last time, their light twisting and writhing, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The shadows surged forward, their jagged forms coiling and twisting, and the thing lunged, its jagged limbs stretching toward me, its void-like center pulsing brighter. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the jagged lines of the carvings twisting and writhing, their glow flaring brightly before fading into nothingness.